I want to tell you guys a little bit more about who I am. So we talked about, like, I'm a creative activist. So there are two things. That means, after a lot of trial and error, that there are two things that I know for sure about myself. Because I, of course, like everyone, have been on a long journey of self-discovery and trying and failing. And, you know, only like a year and a half ago, I was thinking about going to nursing school. You know, I'm like, put out these little feeders and like try this and then pull back and try this and pull back. And I've done that a lot. But there are two things that I'm totally sure of. And one is that I'm an artist. Ever since I was a little girl, that's been the way that I've shown up for life. I've been in plays, I've made things with my hands, I've been a writer, I do anything like that, anything creative. It's how I process fear, it's how I process pain, it's how I process joy, boredom, life. I make art. The second thing that I know for sure now, that I did not know when I was younger, is that for me, art is totally meaningless if it doesn't make it possible for me to connect with, communicate with, and make a meaningful impact in the lives of real people. And that's just my story. But so for me, I really care. I care about justice. I care about people. I really, really care about people. And I believe that people can actually get along. Even people who are not of the same race, people who are not of the same culture, who don't speak the same language, who aren't the same color, who don't choose the same spouse. I believe that all of those people can get along. So I'm an artist and I'm an activist. And first I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the activism piece of things. So Uganda. I've been to Uganda 3 times now. I've been to West Africa once. And what took me to Uganda is the same thing that causes me to do anything. It's like a desire to make a difference, a desire to do something that has a meaningful impact. So when I had an opportunity to go and participate in an organization called Uganda Project and work with them, I took it. And Uganda Project is really little. We're not one of these gigantic organizations. We work with 10 students, secondary and university students, near the capital of Kampala, Uganda. And most of our students have been orphaned by the AIDS epidemic. And we give them tuition and housing and mentoring and support so that they can stay in school. And they run their own lives. It's not uncommon there for a teenager to, you know, run their own show. And so we go once a year just to check in on them, make sure that they're doing okay, see if they need anything beyond their monthly stipend, and to build the relationships. Because for us, it's not just about the money, it's about the relationship. And so we're friends with them. We're on GChat constantly. And we live in a time where we're really lucky that that is possible. So when I was there, Patrick is one of our former students. And now he's working with boys who are living in the slums, who have lost their parents, and are running around in packs in these gangs. And there are so many children who are doing that. And so I knew that Patrick was working in the slums doing that kind of work, and he invited me to come and join him. And he's like, come meet the boys, come into the slum, you know, bring your camera. And in my head, I'm like, oh, I cannot tell my mother about this. I cannot tell my mother about this. Because, of course, that didn't sound like a good idea. That didn't sound like a great idea. So I knew that I would need to do some real critical thinking about whether or not that was a good idea. And so one of the things that I thought about was the perceived reward of me going in, and I had to weigh that against the perceived risk. And I say perceived because it's so tempting to act like I know what the reward will be, and I know what the risk will be. But of course I don't actually know. So I have to weigh my perceived idea of risk and reward against each other, and I have to really think deeply about what are my motivations. What are my motivations as a person and as a photographer and as an artist and as an activist? Like, am I going to gape? And I had to look hard because there is a part of me that wants just to go and see how bad it is, just to gape. And I had to ask myself if the other parts of me were strong enough that it warranted going in anyway, even though I knew that part of me was real, that just wanted to check it out, even though they're real people. And so I had to think about that, and I wanted to identify as many of my assumptions as I could, which is hard to do. That's the problem with assumptions, right? They're hard to identify because we assume them. But I was trying to figure out, what am I assuming that might get me into trouble. You know, I'm assuming that they're going to react this way, this way, this way. How might that not go well? I'm assuming that I'm going to, you know, that it might be a threat to my safety. Well, one option is to take in security. But then I have to think about, I'm assuming that if I go in with a guy with a gun, that's going to send a message that I'm not here to have a nice, peaceful time. So those are the kinds of things that come up with critical thinking, and it's all in this effort to be prepared. So this is super American. This idea of like being prepared, it's so Boy Scouts. And this idea is that if I do my homework, then I will feel comfortable, right? If I do my homework and I do my preparation, I do my critical thinking, I will be prepared and I will not be embarrassed and I will not feel uncomfortable and I'll be able to go in and have a semi-predictable experience. Well, unfortunately, for my line of work, this notion of being prepared and you know, that critical thought is going to give me my preparation doesn't work, because critical thought does not actually equal readiness when you're working on the margin. So for me, I'm interested in cross-cultural communication. So that's the fringe. That's where two cultures butt up against each other, right? And in Greeley, you have a lot of experience with that. Quite a bit, in fact. You know, and so you guys probably know what I'm talking about. Like, it's a ragged, ragged edge where these cultures butt up against each other. And so for me, critical thought is not, readiness is not an outcome that I have the right to expect when I'm working with people who have been disenfranchised, who have been marginalized, whose voices typically don't get a part in the table, right? Don't get a seat at the table. So readiness is impossible. So I'm more interested in willingness. Not readiness, but willingness. And I want to have the willingness to be uncomfortable, that's first. And that's very like Americans don't like to be embarrassed or uncomfortable or anything like that. We really like to know what's what and to be the guy with the answers. But so I have to have the willingness to be uncomfortable, and I also need to have the willingness to move through my fear. And I need the willingness, like signing up, like, yes, I stamp my own approval. I will be wrong. The willingness to be wrong. Like, that is an outcome I have reason to expect when I'm working on the ragged edge. So for me, when I know that that's one of the outcomes that's likely to happen is I'm going to be wrong, for me, I think it's more important to exercise humility than caution. So caution gets us to a point, you know, like caution is like, oh, be careful, don't touch that, it looks hot. But sometimes I don't have enough information to know what's going to burn me, and I have to go out and just touch it and find out. Humility is the piece that lets me repair when I get it wrong. And so one of the ways that I demonstrate humility, especially when I'm working across cultural lines, is I have what I call just a guest mentality. And we all know how to be guests. When I'm in someone else's home, I behave differently than I behave in my own home. And when I'm in another country, it's that simple. I behave as a guest because I am a guest, right? But for Americans, again, this doesn't always come so easy for us. So a little humility and a little bit of a guest mentality will help me to kind of repair things when I inevitably do get it wrong and have an opportunity when I feel, or have a situation in which I feel like I've stumbled or I've put my foot in my mouth. Because of course in my heart there's a part of me that just wants to run when I feel embarrassed, when I feel like I've said something stupid. And there's so many other examples, well, and I'm going to get back to those in a second. So first of all, like the phrase that I use to describe that style is critical action. So critical thought is our prep work, and it's mandatory, right? I have to do my critical thinking to make sure I'm really looking at it from multiple angles and I'm not just taking anybody's word for it. But that is never going to prepare me. It's not going to give me all the information that I need. So critical action is when I go anyway. When I go anyway, with a willingness to get it wrong and more humility than caution. So in that situation, okay, so here I am in Uganda. I am a white American woman going into a slum. There is no reason in the universe that I should feel comfortable in that situation. If I felt comfortable in that situation, that says a lot more about my arrogance and my ego than reality. It means I'm not taking something in. Because of course it's going to cause a commotion. Just walking down those lanes, you saw them littered with trash, just walking down there, Being white, daring to step over the raw sewage. That's like the border of Kisenyi, which is this slum. And there's this ditch of raw sewage, and there's a single board that leads across, and that's how all these people in this community are getting in and out, on this single board. And they just, all these people come in, and then they run across this board. I was terrified. I was like, I'm gonna die before I even get into the raw sewage, which is great. And so stepping in, it was just like, this is a moment. I'm asserting myself. This is not an accident. So in moments like that, it's absolutely appropriate for me to feel uncomfortable. For me, I choose to do it anyway, because it's how I've actually had some of my most exciting, best experiences and the greatest reward. But it usually comes from having to make a few mistakes first. You know, one of my good friends that I've worked with in Uganda is a Black American named Shannon. And when she and I first met, we had approximately 8 days on the ground in Uganda to go from 0 to 60. We had to trust each other fast. And she didn't know me, I didn't know her, and she interpreted a comment that I made as racist. And I am a white girl who went to Cherry Creek High School in Southeast Denver. And I have been afraid of that moment my whole life. My whole life. And for about a decade, I carried around white guilt like a big old badge because I didn't know how to be anything other than who I am. And the good news is, it turns out we can't, right? We can't. And I was so terrified, everything in me wanted to run backwards. You know, I'm not that, how could she think that? I'm gonna go over here and talk about how she could think that about this and blah, blah, blah. And it was excruciatingly awkward and uncomfortable to say, and to have the conversation with her over those days, will you share with me how you interpreted that so that I can learn about how I can make a difference in the way that I do that next time? Will you let me sit here? I want to be your friend. And I am afraid that you will never see me as anything other than that white girl who said that thing that you didn't like. But I want to work this out. And she was like, oh, I really don't want to like you. And she's like, but I want to work it out. And in a very short amount of time on the ground in Uganda, we were able to come to a place where now we're really good friends and we're able to keep communicating and collaborating. That's critical action. It's not pleasant. We don't all come from the same background. It's not easy. It shouldn't be easy. So for me, one of the ways that I give myself a break now, because that's one of the things I struggle with, if you can't tell, giving myself a break is really hard sometimes for me. And one of the ways that I've learned to practice that gentleness is just trying to figure out, like, okay, so let me just, as early as I can see it, let me own when I don't have the answers, and just try and open myself to whatever may come, and try and have an opportunity. Just not knowing sometimes is enough when I'm trying to make a connection with somebody who's from a different background than me, particularly around culture, race, language, religion. Don't forget that one. That's a big one, right? So that, for me, is my style of activism. It's about getting into situations where critical action is required. And I have had to feel uncomfortable again and again and again. And I've gotten it wrong again and again and again. And in that moment when it's really, really embarrassing, or when I make a big mistake, ask me later if we're talking about the light stick problem I had in Mauritania in West Africa. It was super awful. But when I make these huge mistakes and I'm in that moment and I think I want to die and I never want to do anything again, you know, when I survive that moment, the work that comes out of it and the connections and the relationships that I have made with real people all over the world far outweigh the discomfort of being in that situation. And so that's my brand of activism. So I want to talk just briefly also about how art comes into that, because there are plenty of people who are activists who are not artists, and they have their own method. And for me, well, part of it is just that I actually don't feel like I have a choice. As I said earlier, art has always been the thing that I go to. So when I go and have an experience like going to this slum, you know, I write about it. I take pictures. I string those pictures together in a story. That's my processing. That's how I process anyway. Putting it together in such a way to share it with you is a little bit different. And so for that, we live in the age of information. We have access in this country. We have access to all the information that we could possibly want. So here's some data about Uganda, right? There are 80,000 people who live in Kisenyi, that slum. 80,000 people live in that one slum. And 60% of the urban population of Uganda lives in slums. 2.5 million children have been orphaned by AIDS just in Uganda, right? So those are all numbers, that's data. Well, those sound really big and really important and meaningful, but I don't actually have any idea what 80,000 looks like. You know, it just sounds really, really big. So information is not the same as understanding, right? Knowledge about data, about facts and figures, does not actually make me understand something. For understanding, I think understanding comes from empathy. And I believe, in my experience, art is the most efficient way to build empathy. And also, information does not cause action. Inspiration causes action, right? Everybody has access to all the information. And if I'm somebody and I'm trying to give someone information, I want them to care about my cause, and I'm like, do you know what these numbers mean? In my own inbox, I have probably any day of the week, and I'm sure artists, creatives, we're all the same. We all belong to a bunch of different newsletters, and you have access to all these things. And I probably have at any given moment 5 different African organizations sending me requests for money, probably 20 different ones that I'm on for the United States of various things, and they're all sending me their information. And the ones that I end up getting connected with are the ones that give me an opportunity to feel empathy for their cause. Because once I feel empathy, I'm not on the outside, I'm on the inside. I'm with them now. And it's impossible for me to extricate myself when I feel empathy. So as an artist, I'm interested in building that kind of empathy. And so the way that I think of it is since the beginning of human socialization, people have been really into building campfires and telling stories around a fire. And people, they tell these, big dramatic stories. And then people lean in and they listen. And so for me, I'm thinking about that and I'm like, okay, so if I have this thing that I want people to understand and know, and I'm one person and they are many, ye are many, and I am but one. So if I want all of you to get something, I can do a ton of work and I can jump up and down and I can hit you with figures and I can be like, the slum situation in Uganda is really bad, blah, 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 right? Or, because I am one and you are many, I can build a fire that generates some heat and some interest, and you will come to warm yourselves at that fire. And you will come to hear the story. And you will lean in so that you know what's going on. And your own desire is your fuel. And I just have to represent the point of view then. So that's way more efficient, right? That's really a lot more efficient. And especially when there's a lot of competition, because we live in a time when there's more competition for interest, our attention, than ever before. So for me, I'm like, well, okay, instead of me jumping up and down a lot, I'm going to build this fire. I'm going to build the best fire I can. And the people who need to warm themselves at this fire will come. Will come. And that's been my experience with using something like Slum Story to try and explain this. And and it doesn't come with a pitch. It doesn't come with and here's, I also need money now. It's just, for me, I felt inspired when I went there. I felt like I needed to take action because I was there, right? We don't need empathy if we have experience. Empathy is the pseudo experience, right? So when we have an experience, we can get inspired and then we want to take action. So I came back and I was like, what do? I don't know, I'm an artist. I guess I take pictures and I write things and I perform things. And so I made a written photography performance. And that's it, and then I tell that story. And I do that again and again in different ways. And I think, for me, the message of this one, of Slum Story, and the reason that this has stuck with me, and of course, it's funny because being in that slum, I didn't cry. I didn't cry when I saw the young kids who were high, although I certainly could have. I didn't cry when I saw people starving. I didn't cry when any of those things were happening. And after we left, we went and we were just looking for some water. And we went and we found a place and we were drinking water and we were sitting, we were going to get a bite to eat. And I said that to Patrick. I said, who are you? He's an orphan. He grew up on the streets. He doesn't even have any memory. His earliest memory is being alone on the streets, begging. So I'm like, who are you? What are you to these guys? What is this relationship? I'm like, give me context. Make it make sense. Quantify it. Are you a teacher? Are you a pastor? Are you a mentor? Are you a helper? And when he said to me, laughing his little butt off when he said to me, like, I'm crazy, right? And he looks at me and he's just like, I'm just a person. And I cried. Because being a person has to be enough. It has to be enough if we're ever going to get anything done. Because it's actually the only thing we are. We are not heroes. We may behave like them sometimes, but we are not heroes. We are not magicians. We are not kings and queens. We are people. And it has to be enough. And until Patrick said that, I don't think I ever gave myself permission to believe that it could be enough to just be a person. And that being a person still gives me the right to try my best to do extraordinary things. That is still my right. And it doesn't mean that I'm something other than a person, if that's how I want to spend my time. So I felt tremendous freedom from that. And really more than anything, you know, this isn't, I don't know, I've spent an hour and a half in that slum. I can't tell their story. I can only tell my story. Write what you know. That's the cardinal rule, right? And so my story is that being willing to take risks, being willing to get it wrong, taking some critical action, and at the end of the day, reminding myself that being a person is enough, even when I want to do great things, that was the gift that I walked away with from that experience. And I hope you guys walk away with something. So thank you very much.